We are going to look at monetizing youth culture. We are going to look at manipulation in media and advertising and in politics, relating back to a study of Freud that we have done in our last section in our class, where we looked at Freud's interpretation of dreams, how he viewed civilization and its discontents, and how naturally, by being in a civilization, your own individuality is always compromised. We're going to, for our class, watch a couple of documentaries by Adam Curtis from the BBC in the Century of Self. There's 4 parts to it, but we're going to watch 2 of them. And then we're going to watch a documentary around the year 2002 called The Merchants of Cool. And we're going to see how advertising used focus groups and used youth archetypes and coolness, maybe even inventing some archetypes on things like MTV, selling young people Sprite. And we'll see how all of that was the advertising that has now been replaced by a cheaper form. Again, the simulacra is in effect here. The process of simulacrum is in effect, where now companies do not need to spend money on focus groups or questionnaires to find out what people like or want. They simply can go online on social media, find people who have large followings and who themselves present an identity of cool, and they can tap into that and then give those influencers money to sell products, ideas, whatever. So that same process, the influencer process, is from these earlier processes that we are going to learn from watching The Century of Self, and then also we will see in The Merchants of Cool. And then I found a short documentary on influencers. So you're going to have a pretty good idea of how all of that works. And along the way, we're going to see how the CIA was involved with psychoanalysis and control, and that introduction to how the CIA operates in part 2 of Century of Self. We are going to continue into our next section in our class, which is about art and politics. We'll do a section on the CIA and their dirty tricks. We will look at politically active art. And then we will look at the hidden worlds of Trevor Paglen. And we will see how art is kind of calling out and allowing us through art to look at these processes of the CIA. We'll look at CIA literature also in the process. Okay, so let's get started here. So Barth's Psychology and Monetizing Culture and Introduction. We are going to be studying Barth's, in particular in The Merchants of Cool, on the concept of quantification of quality. This is one of the 7 ways that he points out semiosis. We studied that in our earlier lecture. So treating differences as kind of differences in degree. Modern myths are measuring reality by numbers, not by qualities. So we measure good and bad based on bottom line a lot of times. How much money can it make? When language cannot handle the complexities of reality, it strives to economize the world. Qualities become quantities, and once again, language goes beyond the reality to judge it. This is a figure concealed in all the preceding ones. Myth understands reality more cheaply by reducing any quality to quantity. The quantification of quality is summed up as economizing culture. Barth's example is theater. which is supposed to be viewed as an incredible form of art where people can truly relate to the characters and plot. However, given this quality of reality and the essence of theater, it is possible to create a business in the theater. The cost of the ticket, the best actors, the luxurious stage sets, all are examples on how it's possible to transform the meaningful aspects of life into materialistic commodities. And then we also judge the success of these theatrical runs in terms of how much money does it pull in. So popular theater is not always about the most meritorious subject matter. It's a compromise between the merit of the subject matter and also money. So in this phenomenon, we're going to study Freudian theory, politics, youth, art, and culture. So we're going to spend much of this week on two documentaries called The Century of Self by Adam Curtis. He has written several other documentaries. I think Hypernormalization was really important when it came out in 2016. But we are going to center on the 4 one-hour documentaries, and we'll look at 2 of them, Century of Self. So in this documentary, Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, changes our perception of the mind and its workings. The documentary explores the various ways that governments, global organizations, and corporations have used Freud's theories. Freud and his nephew, Edward Bernays, is the first to use psychological techniques in public relations. The term propaganda after World War I, because of what the Nazis do it, they changed the term propaganda to public relations. Those are discussed in part 1. His daughter Anna Freud, a pioneer of child psychology, is also mentioned in part 2. And then William Reich, an opponent of Freud's theories, is discussed in part 3. Along these lines, The Century of Self asks deeper questions about the roots and methods of consumerism, commodification, and their implications. It also questions the modern way in which people see themselves, the attitudes to fashion and superficiality. The business and political worlds use psychological techniques to read, create, and fulfill the desires of the public, and to make their products and speeches as pleasing as possible to consumers and voters. Curtis questions the intentions and the origins of this relatively new approach to engaging the public. Where once political processes were about engaging people's rationale, conscious minds, as well as facilitating their needs as a group, Stuart Ewing, a historian of public relations, argues that politicians now appeal to primitive impulses that have little bearing on issues outside of narrow self-interests of a consumer society. Take a look at the headlines of any news outlet and you'll find that to be pretty accurate. The words of Paul Mazur, a leading Wall Street banker working for Lehman Brothers in 1927, is cited, "We must shift America from a needs to a desire culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old have been entirely consumed. Man's desires must overshadow his needs." In other words, we need to make products that have a short lifespan on them, so we will buy new products. And you see that especially today in refrigerators and televisions and cell phones. Everything is designed not to last. And ideally, there's a technology that will also evolve that will make your older technologies, like your laptops and your phones, impossible to use unless you buy something new. In part 4, the main subjects are Philip Gold, a political strategist, and Matthew Freud, a PR consultant and the great-grandson of Sigmund Freud. In the 1990s, they were instrumental in bringing the Democratic Party in the US and the New Labour in the United Kingdom back to power through the use of focus groups, originally invented by psychoanalysts employed by US corporations to allow consumers to express their feelings and needs just as patients do in psychotherapy. Curtis ends by saying that although we feel we are free, in reality, like the politicians, we have become the slaves of our own desires, and compares Britain and America to a democracy, a exhibit in 1939 in the World's Fair created by Edward Bernays, who you will become quite familiar with. So the first two parts of the film, the first one is entitled Happiness Machines. The film starts with the ideas of Sigmund Freud, who believes that humans are irrational and are governed by their subconscious fears and desires. His nephew, Edward Bernays, puts his theory to practice and got to work to build a social structure that controls the masses that could not be trusted to control themselves and would pose a threat otherwise. Bernays worked with business and government to use the techniques and ideology he took from Freud. One of his great success stories was getting American women to smoke, which previously was unheard of. However, Bernays associated it with gender equality, calling them torches of freedom, and it took off like a wildfire, pun. The techniques he applied are astonishing, and he paid women at mass gatherings for suffragette movements for women to vote, and had women start smoking at these gatherings that he had planted, announcing that these cigarettes were another form of freedom, and it worked. So what Bernays realized was that people needed to be very different from what they want. What people needed was very different from what they wanted, and that the latter was way more profitable for business. As long as people's desires were fulfilled, governments can do pretty much whatever they wanted. The National Socialists of Germany essentially shared the same belief about democracy as Bernays did, and it didn't work. Bernays' solution was to build a system that provides an illusion of democracy and well-being, while the Nazis were straightforward. They would abandon democracy for an alternative that would channel the masses' uncontrollable energies in ways that held the energy together, held the nation together. In other words, the Nazis believe that people were awful and brutish and needed tight control for society to work at its best, and obviously didn't end well for them. In the socioeconomic system Bernays helped build, people are not active participants, but passive consumers. People are not in charge, often their innermost, often irrational desires are. In part two, we get into, again, Bernays, and it doesn't take long for big business in the US to go from psychoanalysis to focus groups in order to figure out their deepest fears and desires of people that people didn't know themselves, and to manufacture the matching products to these things. Ernest Dicker realizes that people didn't always know what they wanted, and the origins of their desires were often in the unconscious. He essentially invented the focus group, which gave him a chance to observe consumers using and interacting with products and letting them talk freely about them rather than asking straight questions. One of his memorable achievements was when an instant cake didn't sell well. He figured out it was because housewives felt guilty for not doing any work. So they made the women who bought the cake mix add their own eggs to the mix, which changed the perceived ease in making the instant cake, and now women felt like they deserved the credits for the work, and the sales soared. Psychoanalysts like Dicker trained corporations to identify and exploit people's fears and desires. By the early 1950s, their ideas became widely accepted in business as well as politics. The reason they did what they did was they believed that by regulating people's wild desires and unconscious fears, we'd all live in a better society. By giving people products that complement their personalities, products could identify with people, that they could identify with, and people would become more stable emotionally and able to lead more balanced, happy lives. Psychoanalysts believe that ordinary individuals in the masses are not capable of being democratic by themselves unless their unstable way of being is controlled. In part two, Freud's daughters Anna was determined to spread her father's theory as well take it a step further, and she did. She took a troubled mother and her 4 children and moved them into a new environment in combination with psychoanalysis that was supposed to cure them of anxiety and aggression. The experiment seemed to work, but decades later, the problems resurfaced and several of the then grown-up children committed suicide. One of the outright deceitful acts of Bernays under the umbrella of shaping public opinion was his way of making Guatemala look like a communist threat to the U.S. and overthrowing its government. Bernays sent over American journalists and made sure the people they talked to painted the picture that he wanted. He went as far as organizing anti-American demonstration to set up a fake news agency and setting up a fake news agency just to spread fake news about the threat that Guatemala posed to the U.S. He did all of this with the justification that the Cold War had to be won and the American way of life had to be preserved. However, the masses were not able to act rationally, so they had to be manipulated. Bernays called this the engineering of consent. The CIA went even further. They funded brainwashing experiments in which they tried to erase the memories of people and create new identities that were in line with their interests. They succeeded in erasing memories, but failed miserably to reprogram anyone. Psychoanalysis' influence and power peaks in the 1950s in America and starts to decline in the 1960s. Marilyn Monroe, who was a patient of a prominent psychoanalyst, committed suicide, which raised a lot of questions about the effectiveness of their methods. Then books appeared and influencers spoke up against psychoanalysis, saying that the system they helped build was based on planned obsolescence and helped a small elite to get rich by exploiting and controlling the masses through manufacturing products that repressed and fulfilled their hidden desires. So the pendulum swung the other way. Psychoanalysts were now accused of building a society that corrupts the innocent individual as opposed to the Freudian idea of the evil and dangerous individual that was a threat to society. Now, the last 2 of these we're not going to watch. In the third one, we see where a rival of Anna Freud, William Reich, believes that people are not dangerous and primitives and need to be repressed. He believes that through the sexual energy that they can express freely to be healthy, that humans are inherently good, and that society wants to repress their inner energies and make them look and maybe act sick and dangerous. So he also believes in some other weird stuff. His views become popular after his death, particularly in the 1960s, when people are taking to the streets and demonstrating against corporations and governments and fighting against the war in Vietnam. Demonstrators were overpowered by the state, which resulted in a change of tactics. The personal becomes political. People started making the changes in themselves that they couldn't make by demonstrating and getting the end of the Vietnam War. Psychologists that followed and took Reich's teaching further developed methods for people to express their innermost fears and desire and allowed them to shed controls of the conditioning imposed by society, things like est. The movement that started with small isolated experiments quickly spread nationwide to the U.S. in the 80s. Corporations realized they had to conform to the nonconformist consumers in order to stay in business. Abraham Maslow and his pyramid of needs provided a basis for business to segment society into groups that had their own desires. It also became clear that there was a limit to being different. The ways in which people like to express themselves could in fact be categorized. This was called his method of values and lifestyle system, with self-actualization on the top, esteem needs below that, belonging and love needs, safety needs, psychological needs, basic needs to psychological needs to self-fulfillment needs. The exact same methods used for advertising for consumers also were used in politics and helped get Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher into power because they appealed to the inner directives group, those who could not be identified with traditional methods and wanted to be part of all social classes and demographic groups. But by going after their values and figuring out what mattered to them, less government, more individualistic society, they were able to give them exactly what they wanted. The hippie movement started as a rebellion against the state and big business, but it ends up being consumed by both. And the very last of the 4 episodes, which might be for people who aren't really into the politics of Britain and the United States in the 80s and 90s. The last, and if you are interested, this is the best one. So in this episode, 8 people sipping wine in Kettering, we are getting a classic model of politics, different candidates showing up with different agendas, and the political parties are beginning to realize that for them to stay in power or to gain power, they have to figure out people's innermost desires and that they have to run on those platforms, and then whatever they do in office is up to them. In other words, it's not about what they do in office as much as power is about getting into office. And then I found a short criticism also on this that is saying, he's got some points here. Adam Curtis has made a pretty good documentary, but he also maybe is simplifying things just a little bit. And again, trying to take these very complex situations and for the documentary is streamlining and simplifying them for us. And as we know from watching The Lathe of Heaven and the disaster of William Haber trying to control George Orr's dreams, we could see that there's kind of a similar thing happening here. For your assignment, I want you to watch the documentaries, the first 2. I want you to see how Bernays uses Freud's ideas, what is public relations, what do people in public relations do, what does it mean to get people to buy what they desire, not what they need, give examples, is that still true today? In what ways do we see people's fears being manipulated to act or vote in politics? In what types of ways does the government and CIA manipulate people through the psychoanalytical process? Always give me direct examples. Do not just be like ChatGPT and give me generalities without then telling me exactly where you have got this general idea from. And then what are your opinions and observations on the 2 films? And I say that we've seen so far, we're only going to see those 2. Next part of the class, the marketing to teens, the merchants of cool. So this is from 2001, and it begins by talking about how We have people that spend their jobs are sifting through market research data, conducting endless surveys and focus groups. Again, we all find out about that from studying The Century of Self. And everyone in business and advertising is looking for the next big thing and trying to get young people to spend their money. These are the merchants of cool, the creators and sellers of popular culture who have made teenagers the hottest consumer demographic in America. Are they simply reflecting the teen desires, or have they manufactured these desires? And just like the documentary by Adam Curtis, they are, of course, manufacturing these desires and these archetypes, like the mook and the midriff, where we are seeing these personalities that are being manufactured on reality TV on MTV. And then we're seeing those exact same characters at spring break and beginning to realize that perhaps these characters were not actually existing directly in America. They were probably pointed to, but now we are seeing them come to fruition through television, and ultimately, once a teen has decided that their personality is going to attach to one of those archetypes, they become very easy to market to. So again, marketing is not always very simple, and we should realize that MTV, something we studied early in the class where we took rock and roll up to MTV, well, by the 90s, MTV is no longer invested in playing music. It instead has become, and somewhat invented, the reality TV market. And in this reality TV market, we are seeing now shows aimed at teens, and again, aimed at creating and showing us archetypes that these teens can buy into and also begin to purchase the way to become those teen types of archetypes. The midriff, a character pitched to teenage girls, highly sexualized, word-weary sophisticate that increasingly populates shows like Dawson's Creek and films such as Cruel Intentions. Also appealing to marketers is the midriff's male counterpart, the mook. Characterized by infantile, boorish behavior, the mook is a perpetual adolescent, crude, misogynistic, and very, very angry. And again, how do we get these archetypes to make money? Put them in clothes, put them in sunglasses, show them drinking certain kinds of beer or soda, and again, trying to get teens to mimic the archetypes and purchase the archetypes. So Frontline then is doing this documentary, and we are seeing then the types of bands that are also involved in this marketing to teens. Bands like Limp Bizkit, Rage Against the Machine, and I think the most interesting of all of this is the Insane Clown Posse. Because the Insane Clown Posse, who paint their faces like we saw with Baby Metal and we saw in Kabuki Theater, the Insane Clown Posse, we have white rappers from Detroit painted up like evil clowns and trying to make music that is so offensive to everybody that it can't possibly be used in mainstream advertising. And what, of course, is interesting is they are all part of a movement called Rage Rock in the early 21st century, and Insane Clown Posse is going to be at Woodstock 99 and be a part of all of it. So we are in one big enclosed feedback loop, according to Douglas Rushkoff. Kids culture and media culture is now one and the same, and it is impossible to tell which came first, the anger or the marketing of anger. And therein lies the danger of 2001's teen-driven economy, observers say. Everyone from record promoters to TV executives to movie producers um, are all are all involved with today's teens. And again, that idea of the rage that comes through it. So kids are now frustrated and lonely because they are encouraged to feel that way, says Frontline. And what I would like to do is for us to take a look at this documentary and then kind of see how advertising creates archetypes, which we again have also studied with the Century of Self as well. And then we take it up to what's going on today with influencers. So now with influencers, still behind the scenes, we have all the companies and the marketers and the public relations people, and they are all scouring social media online to find people who have used social media to have a lot of followers. And what advertising realizes is that the way that you make money is getting people's attention. So when somebody's watching a TV show and their attention is on that TV show, you have a commercial that because you have their attention, you know that they're hearing the message. And the same thing is happening through influencer culture as well, where now teens are given products and money and they are performing their own shows. So in other words, advertising has taken a lot of the costs out of this. They don't need the focus groups. They don't need the reams and reams of data and material. They simply can figure out who has the most followers and then try to tap into that influencer's perceived self-generated influence and coolness and then sell stuff. One of the things that we see in the Merchants of Cool is we see shepherd fairies obey clothing. I talked about this briefly when we looked at a clip from They Live with the sunglasses, where underneath the world around us is this secret world and a false consciousness that we live in. And Shepard Fairey is a street artist who invented Andre the Giant Has a Posse and put up posters with this giant. And in doing this with this giant, he also sees the movie They Live, and he starts adding the word obey to the head of Andre the Giant. And this becomes a signal as an artist who now is going to start selling apparel, and a way that this apparel is part of the resistance to advertising culture, not one in the same, which of course it is. Just when I thought Fairey was going to disappear, he did the Hope poster for Barack Obama in 2008. And he's using the same technique as Andre the Giant, the flattened artwork, and the single word to sum up an entire either Andre the Giant and his posse or the entire reason to vote for a politician. So in his manifesto in 1991, and since he posted on his website, he links his work with Heidegger's concept of phenomenology. His Obey campaign is from the John Carpenter movie They Live, which starred a pro wrestler, a number of slogans including Obey as well as This Is Your God. And this is also based on The Medium is the Message, borrowed from Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who says that the message of television is its television. The message of the internet is that it's the internet. The message of Snapchat or Facebook or Instagram is it's one of those medias. And certain medias are always desired and found by new youth generations to say, hey, Facebook is for older people now, or this social is for, and again, each one of these medias is a designation of cool beyond just whatever messages are coming from the youth. So again, we've watched this clip here from They Live. When the sunglasses go on, we see that all of the world around us is underneath the messages, consumed, staying asleep. And of course, this is the sticker and the poster from Shepard Fairey, Obey. And this has popped up recently online. These are the aliens in John Carpenter's movie, They Live, that are really running the world and getting us to be passive so they can be rich and run things. Obviously, Obey became a brand, still is a brand, has gone from being popular to not popular. And over my decades teaching, every once in a while I have a student who their entire identity of being a nonconformist is wearing Obey clothing. There is a very funny TMZ video here where TMZ asks Shepard Fairey in an airport, when's the last time you've been out on the streets, doing your postering? And his wife is like, come on, he doesn't go out on the streets anymore. He's just a businessman. And Shepard gets really upset because that has taken off the veil of his coolness, which his entire business is running on that. That clip from They Live, just one more time, since in case we forgot about it or we didn't see that first time I showed it during semiotics, here it is again. So our hero has put on the sunglasses, turned the world black and white. We're seeing it from his viewpoint. There's the billboard Obey. Without the glasses, just another billboard. So again, from this film comes an entire empire of Obey clothing. I hope John Carpenter got a cut out of all of this, since this really is his invention here. And again, he goes into a magazine rack, same thing. And then he has this corporate guy that comes by, and again, he's looking at everything in black and white, sees this corporate guy, and it reveals he is not even human. He is an alien.
I said, what's your problem?
Okay, so for our assignment here, after watching The Merchants of Cool, I guess we're not going to watch it in class. I should edit that for you. What are your thoughts on the documentary? Give specific examples from the documentary. Read some of the responses that teens had when they saw the documentary on the PBS website for Frontline. Why is teen culture always something that can be monetized? What is it about youth and culture that equals coolness, obviously beauty and sexuality, and why is it always turning into something that can be bought and sold? Watch this short documentary about influencers, about 15 minutes, and is this the new way to monetize teen cool? Tell me why or why not. And how is this different from the documentary that we watched on the Merchants of Cool? Give examples from both documentaries. The extra credit question that I have you ever purchased anything because an influencer made you want to do so? And then how did you feel after that purchase? Were your wishes and dreams fulfilled by doing that? Okay, everybody, I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Look forward to your thoughts on the subject matter. Bye, everybody.